Hey guys, it's Zach. So this is a completely different game from what I normally talk about. Today I'm going to talk about Path of Exile 1 and 2 and game design decisions related to them. So you've probably heard, if you pay attention to Path or the gaming sphere, or from me, you've heard that Path of Exile 2's new league just released, Dawn of the Hunt, and that people don't like it. I don't like it, a lot of people don't like it, and I want to talk about why these criticisms are valid. Now, that's a weird thing to say because all criticism is valid, but specifically from the context of designers and developers, right? Sometimes League of Legends players have a ton of the same criticism. Most people complain about the same things, right? Good example of this is Zed's absurdly high ban rate. And designers can look at the numbers, can watch the players playing him, can see the top challenger players, and can say, yeah, Zed's genuinely not that strong. Like, he doesn't do anything uniquely broken right now. We don't need to touch him. And his ban rate will still be 20 plus percent. League players' criticisms here are not valid in the eyes of the designers because they are not supported by anything resembling statistics or facts. They're just emotion. And sure, people find like these characters very frustrating and emotion of a player matters, but so does positive emotion. And people who play Zed love those moments when he feels broken. It's so satisfying to hit 3 shurikens on somebody you've ulted from completely out of range and they just die. And you're like, I picked you, I have outplayed you, and I've destroyed you, and I feel better. Those moments matter a lot to developers, right? So people complaining doesn't necessarily mean a criticism is worth modifying something over. I think the criticisms levied at Path of Exile 2 right now are not only worth modifying the game over, but devs should be specifically paying attention to why these criticisms are happening and be looking at overarching changes to the systems of the game and not just numbers to satisfy the players. So, Path of Exile 2 and Path of Exile 1 are different games, and I will not sit here and do the PoE 1 is better than PoE 2 comparison, complaint, whatever. I'm going to define a couple specific things wrong with PoE 2. I'm going to define why I think they're actually wrong instead of just, oh, I don't like this. And I'm going to talk about a couple solutions that these things could have. So, the first big one, gear progression in the acts. Now, Path of Exile 2's biggest complaints are I don't do enough damage and the areas are too long. These are probably the two biggest ones. Now, whether it's monsters have too much life or I have too little damage, regardless, you've probably heard something along those lines in the campaign from almost anyone who's played through Path of Exile 2. It feels bad to play through the campaign on most skills that are not incredibly meta, on builds that are not incredibly meta. Now, this is subjective, right? You cannot objectively say something feels bad. But I have heard the sentiment echoed by a lot of players, both online in terms of like, oh, there's tons of people retweeting specific ideas, and individually in terms of like myself, a couple other devoted PoE 1 players, and my friends who do not play, oh god, my camera, PoE 1 at all, and are just picking up PoE 2. Maybe they've never played an ARPG. Everybody felt this same thing. I haven't seen other sentiments echoed. So, what does it actually mean to have low damage or slow, like, characters, slow movement through areas? Probably that areas are too long, and if it's this prevalent a complaint, areas probably are a little too long, but they want you to take more time in the acts. They want these areas to feel grueling, and you want to feel rewarded when you make it to the boss and kill them. And they want your fights to be longer individually with magic and rare monsters. They want those encounters to matter more. So they want you to access your tools that Path of Exile 2 is designed around. They want you to access rotations of multiple skills. They want you to access weapon swaps. They want you to play methodically. Okay, how do we balance these concepts? Because in essence, the complaints are PoE 1 players saying, I want to go fast and blow stuff up, and the devs are responding saying, this ain't that kind of game. But there's a middle ground, and it should be reached. The areas are taking too long, physical damage, player damage too low, monster life's too high. All of these things can be solved by giving players more choice. So, in terms of damage, obviously, if players have access to more or better or more diverse gear, they can find the affixes they're looking for. This means that maybe monsters don't kill them as often because they have more life. I'll talk about the passive tree in a second. And that they have more damage, so the buttons they press feel more satisfying, enemies die quicker, and they move through areas quicker. I do think that that would make a difference in both of these complaints, but there is an even bigger one that's clearly available, and it has come up when I've talked to 3 separate friends of mine who have never played PoE 1, which is that it fucking sucks that you can't get move speed through any determinative measure on your boots. People hate it. I hated it, but I was like, well, I have PoE1 zoomy brain. No. People everywhere don't like that your character doesn't get faster. It feels like a game where your character should move faster. These areas are huge. It can take, what, like a good couple minutes if every enemy is dead to simply walk your character from one side to the other, right? No combat, pressure movement skill, run without like mispathing, can still take a couple solid minutes to just move. And this is the kind of game where you should not have those lapses in action unless chosen to have those lapses in action. Your lapses in action should be spent on optimizing your character, maybe trading, maybe looking up stuff, maybe just changing your gear around, selling stuff, managing your stash, but none of your downtime should be in areas where you are moving through to fight stuff. That shouldn't be a thing. If you're exploring or fighting stuff, there should be stuff for you to do. And it isn't a mood-setting game like Breath of the Wild. This is an ARPG. You are in this to kill monsters, get loot, and then use it. So, how do we fix this? How do we fix these two big problems? Well, you can do it at the same time by doing a couple specific things. Increase gear drops, increase currency drops so you can roll your gear more, increase gold drops so you can buy from vendors more, any combination of those, or I would like to propose a single clear solution, which is the Orb of Alteration. If you only play PoE2, Orbs of Alteration are in Path of Exile 1. They're a currency that says use it to re-roll a magic item. So a magic item goes from whatever mods it has to 1, 2, 2 random modifiers on the item. Obviously, you can then augment it, and it'll have two modifiers. What this means is that you can almost deterministically acquire any affix, not a tier, you can't define a tier, but you could probably hit any of, like, 10 or 15 common affixes, like armor, evasion, max life, resistance, flat damage, move speed, percent damage, right? Like, the simple stuff, on whatever piece of gear you want it to hit. Spend 10 or 20 Orbs of Alteration, there's a really good chance you're getting something usable. Probably, if you're willing to pick and choose, you could spend 3 to 5 and get something usable. And one of the things that you can Orbs of Alteration spam for is movement speed on your boots. If you move through areas 20% faster, you feel more than 20% better. You're getting to packs quicker, which means less flat downtime, right? You're having more fun because you're playing more of the game at a time. Not only are you moving faster, but you're playing more Path of Exile. If you are moving faster, you have more agency over dodging things, and dodging these attacks is more important in Path of Exile 2. Enemies have more varied attack patterns, and they have indicators, wind-ups for their big swing, right? They have animations where they charge up their spells, they hit areas, and you're expected to dodge them in some way. It's more like a traditional game where you fight bosses or big idiots, right? So you need agency, and one of the pieces of agency you can get is movement speed. And you probably should be able to access it on boots. If they really don't want to add Orbs of Alteration in, they could add a seeded campaign drop where at some point you can go and get a stash in the corner in Act 1 or 2 or whatever, and it drops 20% movement speed boots, or some unique that gives 15 or 20% movement speed, right? And yeah, this would be powerful. And Orbs of Alteration especially would be a huge increase in player power, not just in the campaign. There is no current way to deterministically reroll the same base over and over and over again in Path of Exile 2. It would greatly change the crafting landscape, because you would alteration spam until you hit 2 perfect implicits for any mid to late game piece of gear, and that would be really, really powerful in a game where you otherwise can't do that. But that's okay, because currently, Path of Exile 2 has a similar meta to Path of Exile 1, with one big problem. PoE2's meta has 5-ish builds at any one time that happen to dominate the game. They're significantly faster, stronger, typically they're 1 to 2 buttons instead of the 8 to 10 that it seems like the PoE2 devs want you to be using. They're well-oiled machines, similar to PoE1 builds. But the builds that aren't those builds put up fractions of these numbers. Yes, if I go to Path of Exile 1's ladder right now in the Legacy of Frisia, and I look at the top damage builds that have enough HP to like be viable, I'm gonna see probably the same shit. I'm gonna see Lightning Strike, I'm gonna see Ice Trap Bossers, which are not map viable, but whatever. I'm gonna see Kinetic Blast, Kinetic Blast of Clustering, I'm going to see Surf Casters playing a couple spell skills, maybe a Hex Blast Miner, right? These things are just expected. But under that are like 60 other really interesting skills with typically at least 2 variations of builds that can all do top-end mapping content. They can't do the literal hardest things in the game currently because the Legacy of Freesia hardest content is really hard and punishing, but they can do almost anything you want. The feeling in Path of Exile 1 of build freedom does not exist in Path of Exile 2. That is a problem, because Path of Exile is a game designed around these insane concepts. And PoE2 has different versions of those concepts, different versions of those moments where you go, does that work? And then, oh my god, it did, this is cheating. But it doesn't feel like cheating, it feels like you have to, right? When I played a character that sent fireballs into ice walls. And in Path of Exile 1, if I pressed ice wall, threw down 3 ice walls, sent fireballs into them, exploded, and shot projectiles everywhere, I would be losing my mind with excitement because that would feel broken. I would be chaining off terrain that I created with just 2 buttons. I would be sending 80, 100 projectiles on screen. And it felt good in Path of Exile 2, but there was a sense of relief. There was an, oh my gosh, I can clear now, right? Because the weird kind of standard cold damage build that I was playing at the time felt terrible in tier 1 and 2 maps. And, you know, my gear was fine. I play enough Path of Exile 1 to know what gear looks like or is supposed to look like. I had, you know, +3 wand with some percent damage. I had reasonable mana on my gear and stuff, and I was still constantly running out of mana. And I was still really struggling to survive more than a couple hits from enemies. And this finally felt like my break to push content in a way that didn't feel terrible. And that's bad. That felt really bad. And yeah, I'm not a top-end player. Yeah, if you looked at my POB, I probably had a ton of issues, but my experience wasn't unique. This is something that happens to all sorts of Path of Exile 2 players, where if you don't do something meta, you don't do something powerful, you feel these walls hit, and the tools to overcome them that exist in Path of Exile 1 the moment you look aren't there in PoE 2 at all. You go back into the area, and you farm the area until you get the gold to buy something from a vendor that fixes your problem, or you level up a little bit more, or you just push through and play really, really slow and safe and methodical. And, okay, that's what they want you to do in the first place, but I don't want to add 10 hours to the campaign because my build feels like dog shit. That's it. This is just one issue, right? I've spent a lot of time kind of rambling and justifying the issue, and the solution. In my eyes, Orbs of Alteration is one of the easiest solutions. There are other things they could do, so let's talk about them. What do you do in Path of Exile 1 if you can't get gear and through some unholy method, maybe you have 0 Scouring Orbs, and everything that drops is rare, you can't use Orbs of Alteration to roll something? Well, there are mechanics that you can run in Path of Exile 1 that specifically drop easier, more accessible gear. And you can do this in the campaign, to a degree. You can definitely do it the moment you hit low-tier maps, which is you can run Essence or Expedition. The Expedition runs in Path of Exile 1 allow you access to vendors that drop specific currency, or with specific dropped currency. These vendors can trade you any of a couple types of items, but the big one is ROG. ROG allows you to trade your artifacts, the things that drop from Expedition, for gear, and craft it. And his crafting options are terrifyingly strong. If you had the ability as a player to use all of ROG's crafting options as individual currency orbs, the average power level of gear at low to mid levels in the game would be massively higher, because ROG lets you make some really crazy stuff pretty easily. You can totally fix your problems with ROG in like 3 purchases. You can fix your reses and some life or some damage or something. Like, it's very expected, and I could probably do that after 3 runs of Expedition, which could easily happen on my 20th map. What if I go Essences? Well, I can force an Essence into every map starting on the 5th map I clear. In my first 4 maps, I can add an Essence to every modifier, or to every map. So I go into the area, I kill the Essence. I get an Essence dropped. The Essence doesn't do what a lesser Essence does in Path of Exile 2, where I have a single roll with a single modifier of any tier, and then I have to Aug, Regal, Exalt it to get something usable. In Path of Exile 1, I use that Essence, and it rolls me a rare item. 4 to 5 modifiers, I have to spend 0 additional currency on it, and typically I can use the crafting bench to then add something else to the item. And at that point, I have probably solved one issue. I have used a max life essence, an evasion essence, a resistance essence. I have used flat damage to my bow essence, or whatever, right? And suddenly there's a power spike, and I can feel it. In Path of Exile 2, access to things like Expedition and Essence don't exist. They should. Now, what does that mean? Well, Expedition and Essence work two different ways. One lets the player craft the gear by dropping additional currencies. One allows you to craft gear through a vendor. The second one, craft gear through a vendor, is probably a lot more appropriate to Path of Exile 2, and something like that should be more easily accessible. Again, because the point isn't we should be Path of Exile 1. The point is we should have control over our characters in Path of Exile 2. So you could add a vendor. There's some, I don't know, add some mechanic. Pick Expedition. Screw it. And give players access to gear that they can customize in some manner that is relatively deterministic. I don't know why we can't do that. I genuinely do not know why we can't do that. You can access trade, and in a couple seconds you can have problems fixed, but in Soul Self-Found you can't do that, right? And you can't do it for nearly as cheap. You have to just sit there and be at the mercy of RNG. What if a new player just doesn't want to use trade right now? They only want to use trade to buy a couple uniques. Well, their experience is gutted because they don't have access to like any consistent farm of Expedition or Essence. And what do you do if you don't have consistent access to farming Expedition or Essence? What do you do if you don't have consistent access to Delve for fossils? If you don't have access to Orbs of Alteration, Chaos Orbs, the Crafting Bench, Harvest? You quit the game. I quit the game. And I didn't quit just because of the crafting, but it was a really big influence. So, that's it. I think that we need more agency as players over the gear we have equipped in Path of Exile 2. But let me know your thoughts. I want to hear all of this. I want to hear if you think this is interesting, lame, boring. I want to hear if you don't like the background footage. I want to hear if you want to talk about Path of Exile 2 more, because I think it's a really interesting game, and to be clear, I think Path of Exile 2 has the potential to be maybe the best game I've ever played. I think it's a lot of Path of Exile 2 is fixing big issues with Path of Exile 1. I'll always like PoE 1 more, but PoE 2 has so much going for it. It just needs to get there. And I think the devs don't understand why they're not getting there, because I really think the player power thing would have been something they'd solve relatively easily if they really wanted to. Thanks. See ya.